At the moment, we have an estimated 1 million women on NHS waitlists for mental health support. And at the same time, there is a nationwide shortage of therapists. What we're starting to see is that the wait times are up to 18 months long. So you can choose to either wait that time, and in most cases, mental health care does get worse, or you end up spending hundreds of pounds out of pocket each month. From a very systemic perspective, we feel that gender-informed group therapy can actually be a fantastic solution to this. But even more than that, we know that for many most common mental health conditions, it's actually just as effective or more effective than individual therapy.
Welcome to the Motherhood Clinic, a podcast about caring for mothers after childbirth, led by clinical experience and real-life stories. If you're a new mom and ever asked yourself, is what I'm going through normal? Should I be worried? Or who should I ask for help? This podcast is for you. It's for anyone navigating those early weeks, months, or even years after having a baby. Each episode brings together voices from across the motherhood journey, from clinicians, experts, and mothers from all walks of life. We're here to help you feel more empowered in your unique motherhood journey. We believe in a better start to motherhood.
Welcome, Claudia. Thank you for joining us on the Motherhood Clinic. So Claudia and I first met at Women's Health Week, which was a conference about a month ago. Claudia, you're doing something in the mental health space, and we'll talk more at length about what that innovation is. For any new mother or mothers listening into this conversation, everyone will be aware of the importance of mental health, in particular after you've just had a baby, where there's a whole myriad of things happening. You're dealing with hormones, you're dealing with a new life stage, dealing with a whole number of things. And I think mental health is a particular area that we want to ensure that women and people in general have a better handle on. But one of the key issues is that it's not always accessible for everybody. And that's where I'd love to delve into this conversation about what you're doing to solve that. So the big theme that we discussed yesterday, Claudia, was this idea of being there for each other. And I'm going to hand over to you in a moment to talk about what that means and what that means for you. But for today's journey, we'll cover three things. So people listening in, we want to talk about your innovation, Circe, talk about your personal journey as to how you've got here and why you're doing this. And then we'll talk more broadly about community-based mental health support and what that means. So that's the journey for today. Claudia, I'd love to hand over to you to give yourself a bit of an intro, who you are and what you're currently doing. Sound good?
Great. Yes,
Okay.
perfect. Well, thank you so much for having me. This is the first podcast I'm on, and I'm very excited to be here. So my name is Claudia, and I am building Circe, which is the first digital platform that connects women to online group therapy. Our mission is to make mental health care more financially accessible, but even more than that, to start rooting mental well-being in community. In terms of the problem that we are trying to tackle, I think in our case, it's one of those cases where we have a very simple solution that can actually address so many problems that we are seeing across so many demographics in society. Just to kind of illustrate what we're trying to tackle, really. So at the moment, we have an estimated 1 million women on NHS waitlists for mental health support. And at the same time, there is a nationwide shortage of therapists. What we're really starting to see is that the wait times are up to 18 months long. So really, you can choose to either wait that time, and in most cases, mental health care does get worse, or you end up spending hundreds of pounds out of pocket each month. From a very systemic perspective, we feel that gender-informed group therapy can actually be a fantastic solution to this. But even more than that, we know that for many most common mental health conditions, it's actually just as effective or more effective than individual therapy. So what we're seeing, for example, is that completion rates are actually higher for group therapy. If we're seeing a 60% completion rate, 40 to 60% completion rate for individual therapy, completion rates for group therapy are actually between 60 to 85%. And a lot of this actually comes from the magic that happens in the groups, and specifically around being both the person that is helping and the one that is being helped. And I think that when we take a step back and think about it, this is really what we want to achieve.
I'll come back to a couple of points that you've mentioned, because I think there's some really important points that we can go into a bit deeper. One was I just had no idea of those kind of stats, the significance of the demand versus the supply. And as you mentioned, if you're having a mental health challenge, having to wait 18 months, and during that time, who knows what may happen. And as you're saying, the right now, the current solutions are inaccessible to many because it's so expensive. But what I really like was this point of, I think most people listening in would assume that individual therapy, because it's more expensive, is better because it's more personalized. Like they're looking just at me. But I love this point where to help yourself, you help other people. Now, that's a concept that I've come across in personal development outside of that, but it's one of those things that we all know we should be doing, but we don't often do. So I just think it's a really lovely point to delve into. And I'd love to explore a bit more, again, the group therapy dynamic. And you mentioned a gender-informed group therapy, so I'd love to explore what that actually means and how does that work. Tell me a bit more about the dynamic of group therapy that makes things this much more effective that you found.
Yeah, so I'm going to preface this by saying that individual therapy is absolutely effective and definitely has an immense amount of value. I myself have gone to individual therapy for years, and I just wouldn't be the same person without it. At the same time, so a quote that I always come back to is that the point of therapy is to know yourself well enough, to learn enough about yourself, to know what you want to lose yourself in. And one thing that has come up a lot from including from therapists is that people in our generation, so for those who are not on video, my generation is millennials. We tend to be very introspective and focused on trying to see what happened in the past to us to explain why we are the way we are today. But then there's this missing step of saying, okay, we actually need to now do something about it and take responsibility for who we are and for how we interact with people in another therapy group or within our wider community. And it is really this dynamic of responsibility that makes the biggest difference.
Wow. I didn't realize this would be such a helpful philosophical debate, but I think it rings so true. Talk to me about the innovation you've created with Circe. How does that work? And what are some of the mechanics that you use? What would a session typically look like?
Yeah, so our end goal is to create a platform where you basically come on, fill out a survey about yourself that includes your life stage, your lived experience, as well as your symptoms. And based on this, we match you into groups of up to 10 people. Once you are matched into the group, you then begin your weekly sessions that are always led by a licensed therapist. In between sessions, we want our platform to be able to provide you with personalized tracking and homework to keep you on track. The thing to kind of like really mention here is that we don't see ourselves we see ourselves as very much a tech-enabled product. And when it comes to the actual therapy that we provide, we're really not reinventing the wheel. I can talk a little bit more about both the technology angle as well as the importance of remaining rooted in evidence. So a lot of people actually don't know this, but there is about 7 decades of research behind group therapy. The issue, however, with the reason it is so underutilized is because that when you do it at small scale, it is actually really difficult to coordinate because you need to have enough people who share the same symptoms and life experiences in order to put them in the group. What we're seeing with, for example, NHS talking therapy groups, at least from the people that we have interviewed, is that you're very likely to end up in groups that are not well curated and well matched, which especially if you are a minority within the context of the group, can actually leave you feeling deflated. And at the same time, the groups can be of up to 18 people, which for more generalized anxiety and depression can technically be okay. But if you have very sensitive personal experiences, especially for postpartum women, smaller groups of between 6 to 10 maximum is actually significantly better suited. So really our innovation is the fact that we're taking group therapy online and the idea being that we're able to scale big enough. The idea is that we want to have enough people sign up for group therapy at the same time so that we can really create these really well-matched groups.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Claudia, and it's so good to hear. I connect it with a point that we've heard from women and new mothers, where, for instance, the typical group you would join as a pregnant mother would be something called NCT, right? But the only thing you have in common, I say the only thing, but the main thing you have in common is the fact that you're having a baby. But outside of that, you may not have any common, something to really tangibly bond over. And so sometimes you find people that feel a little bit isolated or alienated from that because you might not identify with other people because of whatever reason, right? Ethnicity, values, personality. So you can't, I think you've raised a critical point, which is how do you find people that you identify with, not just from the problem you're going through, like I want to know that I'm in the same room as you because we're going through the same thing, but also from other dimensions that I can relate to you. And I think that's a really important point to bring up. And I'm starting to understand, we've talked a lot about the value of community, and we talk a lot about finding your tribe. So I just think it's a really great point to highlight. And as you said, you can only really achieve that at scale. The community only works when you've got a big enough community to then segment into the various bits that you identify with. So I think that's a fantastic achievement that you've done and you can provide. Let's bring the conversation to a postpartum mother who's having some challenges. How would they what would that journey look like if they were to come to you and say, hey, look, this is what I'm going through, and what would that journey start to look like for them? Can you talk us through an example?
Yes, so we want to make it as simple as possible to engage with the platform. So we want to make it as easy as possible for anyone who needs help to access our therapy groups as quickly as possible. Actually, postpartum mental health are actually the first therapy groups that we are going to launch with, which we're very excited about. And the way it's going to work is that simply for a referral, you just come to us, fill out a short survey that measures anxiety and depression, based on which we would then assess whether you are suitable for group work. If we feel that you are not suitable for group work specifically, our counselor would either provide one-to-one therapy for you or refer you to somebody else who can. And sorry, I realize now I actually didn't explain what the actual therapy would look like.
Hmm.
So the way it works, the easiest way to think about it really is kind of like an educational program. So you would be in a closed group of people for between 12 to 16 weeks, and you would always meet with the same people. So once you join a group, the group remains the same. Each week of the between 12 to 16 weeks would have a different topic. So for example, if we're looking at postpartum mental health, we could have 1 week that focuses on, for example, teaching about hormonal changes. 1 week would be centered more around intrusive thoughts, for example. And the way we would structure it is that every session that lasts between 60 to 90 minutes, depending on the group size, would start with a layer of psychoeducation, where we are essentially teaching you about the tools and the concepts behind what we are going to do in the group, followed up by the actual therapy part that is we call it the sharing circle, basically.
That's incredible, Claudia. As you talk, there's so much I can start to see it makes so much sense to me. One of the big things we talk about postpartum is isolation, like feeling like I'm by myself. It makes sense when you talk about it, like that you go into group therapies, you feel like you're on a journey with other people. And what I imagine you start to appreciate is actually the things that you're going through, a lot of people will be experiencing the same thing as you in the same ways, or will be hitting the same milestones. So it makes sense that you would want to do that with other people. And that feeling of progression, I think, is so empowering. I'm telling you this because you know it already, right? But this is more me appreciating, like, why haven't we done this before, right? As you said, there is absolute value to individual therapy, but I think what group therapy does is, again, you're working with other people and finding your tribe. So I really love the insight. Why do you think group therapy is less prevalent than it is?
Well, I ask myself that a lot. I ask myself that a lot as well. We do know that one really big challenge is the logistical difficulty in organizing them at small scale.
I see.
However, I think that one big element of it is that I think that up until very recently, people were not as open to therapy in
Yeah.
general. I think what
Okay.
we've seen, I would say past 20 years, but particularly over the past 10, we've seen really an opening up and destigmatization of mental health conditions. I would say that for societies that are slightly more closed to it, as obviously all countries used to be, I mean, I would argue still are to a large extent,
Yes.
individual therapy can feel like the safer route
Yes.
because a lot of people are worried about breaches of confidentiality, for example. On that point, though, so we tried to, because the question around confidentiality comes up so often for us from our potential customers in our community. And it is actually so exceedingly rare that there's very limited academic research on it. And what we've actually found is that breaches of confidentiality are actually a lot more common in groups that aren't moderated by a therapist, which I found really interesting. But
Mm.
back to the point around why group therapy, I do think it's this that we just weren't open to therapy in general up until 10 years ago is still very,
Yeah.
very recent, I would
Yeah.
argue.
I agree. No, and thank you for raising that, addressing that concern that I think people would have in group therapy, which is I don't want to share my troubles or make it public. I want to have that sense of confidentiality that I know I have with the therapist one to one. So I'm glad that you've addressed that point. And as you're saying, I think the tectonic changes have been a societal change in terms of their attitudes towards mental health, and then a technology shift that's enabled you to gather people at scale and make it easy for you to join these groups, because before that it would be very difficult to do that. So I think that's a really interesting evolution, why now is the right time, why Circe is in the right place to offer those kind of support, which I think is great. Do you want to talk a bit about what's led you to this journey? So your personal journey coming into Circe, because I think there's a lot that I think women listening in and mothers or anyone listening in can take from your journey to actually developing this business. Where were you before? Where are you now? And where do you hope to be in future? Like, tell us a bit about your journey.
Yeah, of course. So I'm not a therapist, I'm not a clinician. I am building from lived experience. In terms of my background, I've actually spent the last 8 years working in the startup ecosystem, startup world. I would consider myself a generalist, but I'm really passionate about community and brand building and how those two work together. At the same time, I always sort of knew that I wanted to start something of my own. And it was also always really important to me that what I do is something that has a positive impact, and that it comes from something that I feel very passionate about. I think anyone who has ever tried to strike out on their own will know how important it is that you enjoy what you do. So in my early 20s, okay, so let me take a step back. I struggled with anxiety and depression for pretty much most of my first 2 decades on
Okay.
planet Earth. And sometime in my early 20s, I finally decided to go to individual therapy, actually. I think I had a total of like 3 or 4 therapists over a couple of years, and it was finally my last therapist who finally diagnosed me with OCD. And then
Mm.
everything just made complete sense. And I would say, though, however, that that diagnosis, even though it really helped me understand myself, it also made me feel incredibly lonely and incredibly isolated.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know if anyone listening in knows what OCD is, but basically, if you Google it, the symptoms that come up sound really scary. So
Mm.
it was really only when I finally started to meet other people who were like myself and to join these peer support groups that I felt like I could really integrate the learnings that I had in individual therapy and really accepted that step into it.
Great. I think that's a really important point. One reflection, by the way, because I saw you pitch at Women's Health Week, and I would never have guessed you had any issues with anxiety. But it was amazing. So I was so pleased, and you won. You won the pitch, which is that's more of a personal reflection on how far you've come. And I think and to launch this business and have the partnership that you're doing hopefully with NHS is incredible. So I think this, just as you said, this is proof of the value of therapy. The other point I wanted to come back to was this idea of you mentioned when you got diagnosed, you understood what you were going through, all of a sudden there was some sort of breakthrough, but both in a good and sometimes not as good way. And I think this comes back to the power of labels. So, we hear a lot from, women that want to self-advocate for themselves. And a lot of times it's finding the words and the vocabulary to describe what you're going through, which I think gives a lot of power because you know what you're dealing with, right? You have to understand it to deal with it. The flip side, as you've mentioned, I think is sometimes with that label, you can sometimes contain and limit yourself, whether it's feeling isolated because now I know I have this thing and it's a formal thing. I guess the thing to be aware of is sometimes we can limit ourselves to that or be defined by that. And I think it's understanding that interplay between how can I use this knowledge to better understand and work my way through whatever diagnosis I have versus being defined by. Was that part of the balance that you had to strike as you dealt with the diagnosis and then, working away from that?
Yes, that resonates a lot. I'm going to caveat what I'm about to say with a reminder that I'm not a therapist. But basically, what really helped, I think, to make a parallel, sometimes you meet people and the only thing they can talk about is work or this problem that they have in life and I think sometimes some people have, including myself, this was part of why I was feeling so deflated when I got the diagnostic. You can get so overly attached to this one part of your identity that you forget that actually, as human beings, we have all of these sides of ourselves. And just because this one thing isn't the way we thought we are, doesn't mean that all of these other areas of our life are going to suddenly disappear.
Mm.
And I think it's really important. I think this is especially where group therapy is really helps you step out of this loop because it's going to sound really harsh, but you basically realize all of us are special, but actually none of us are that special. I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. That's reality. That's not harsh. That's just true. That's true.
Yeah. And I think this is pretty much, and I find it really interesting that you mentioned the thing about labels because I was actually talking to someone the other day who works with specifically neurodivergent children. And we do know that there is a surge in diagnoses nowadays, which is not a bad thing necessarily. It's usually mostly because people are finally aware enough and the system is finally providing extra help where needed in order to level the playing field, which I am totally for, by the way. But at the same time, there is a debate and a conversation around how the children are told about the diagnoses so that they don't internalize it as something that will basically put them into a box or make them think that they are limited in ways that they are just not.
Yeah. There's so many interesting points you bring up, Claudia. I mean, we've talked previously about the identity shifts you go through in any of these life events, in particular motherhood or parenthood. And sometimes when you get too wedded to a particular definition or identity, and when that identity is then taken away, it's very difficult to deal with. But it's realizing actually we all wear many faces, So the example I can take obviously not as a mother, obviously in our job, so many of us define ourselves by our titles. Like I'm a manager, I'm a partner, I'm a VP, etc. And then, the simple example is when you get made redundant and then you no longer have that title and you introduce yourself. So what do you do, Claudia? It's like, well, actually I'm unemployed and that's your title, as opposed to I'm a VP at a bank or whatever. Like there's a certain prestige and I'm a mother, I'm a sister, like I'm OCD diagnosed. Like, what do these labels mean? And it's what labels we give to ourselves. But as you said, it's realizing that they are all part of you, but they are not all of you. And if you had a list of all the labels that you have, which ones could you live with and what could you live without? So for me, I can live without the title of, partner or manager. But if you take away the label of dad, like I could never live without that. So it's interesting just to consider, because most of us don't think about that, I guess, explicitly. But as you're saying, from the conversation, you can probably see in a lot of people how they do think about themselves because of what they attach themselves to. The point that I want to raise that I think you clearly articulate is, by being part of these groups, by understanding that these identity shifts that you go through, it helps to understand that and see that in other people, as you're saying, so to appreciate actually the way that you see other people as is in so many different ways. The other one I wanted to come back to was, you mentioned that obviously you're not a therapist, you're non-medical, But at the same time, there is a real role for people like yourself to play in defining what does good treatment look like. So I'd love to talk a bit about your experience. You've been in the branding and an accelerator background, and that outside perspective that maybe you bring to, a typically medically, clinically informed setting. What has that been like?
I, I would preface it by saying that I think getting over imposter syndrome is very, very difficult. But I do think there is a lot of value for people, not only in the mental health care space, but in the healthcare space more general, for there to be people that are involved with building the products from a lived experience perspective. I think that, so I was actually so nervous talking about this specific topic that I actually spent quite a bit of time last night researching other successful healthcare companies built by non-medics.
Let's
So I
jump
can
in. Let's
say,
jump. Let's go. Let's go, Claudia. It's no stopping.
so I think the advantage that non-medics bring is that you focus a lot more on the user experience and the customer experience, which obviously you can't necessarily do within established public healthcare services. But if you're building a sort of like alternative product that sits outside the NHS, for example, then building from customer, if you're building a private company, essentially building with the customer experience in mind beyond just the clinical outcomes is invaluable, not only to attracting those customers and keeping them on, but also to make sure that you are a commercially viable business. I fundamentally believe that in order to make a big impact as a mission driven company, you also have to be a big company. I used to have a former boss who always said that he doesn't want to back sort of the corner store companies because they're small and not gonna touch that many people's lives, even though they're fantastic companies. And
Yeah.
this is really where I think that my background comes into play. I would, however, caveat this by saying that I think it's really, really important to, as non-clinical founders, make sure that we surround ourselves with the right advisors, co-founders, team members who do have that clinical experience.
Yes.
One huge pet peeve I have at the moment is all of these sort of like coaches, but who don't have any sort of formal education or certification, speaking about subjects that they're not really in the place to talk about, or are best case scenario just giving advice that doesn't work, worst case scenario actually spreading dangerous misinformation.
Yes.
I think we're seeing this a lot within the wellness space at the moment. I mean, when I keep seeing collagen advertised to me, and I know for a fact that our bodies actually don't absorb collagen into the skin. It gets transformed into a protein, apparently. Again, I'm not a doctor, but I think this is a really good example. And I think women are significantly more targeted by this than men. I think there is a larger conversation to be had because a lot of women actually don't get listened to by doctors, and a lot of symptoms have been sort of ignored. Actually, I don't know if you know this, but women are 1.5 times more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety for the same symptoms as a man would present to at the GP. It's really important to us that we maintain that everything we do at Circe is very much rooted in clinical evidence and is evidence backed.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think, again, you've got some great points in there. And I would also frame the point that, there is a role for non-medics and medics to work together. And it's not that we would encourage a non-clinical person to suddenly create a clinical venture without any backing. The point here is that that partnership is critical, because the little I've learned in the health tech space is, you have non-clinical founders that that have the business background, but they kind of go off and they solve the wrong problem because they haven't got the understanding really from the patient and the clinical perspective. And equally, you might have at the other end clinical founders that may not have the business side of things to then marry. So that kind of, hopefully that partnership between two of them and that openness to what both bring to the conversation is where I think, valuable things can come out. There was also this point you mentioned around this interplay between profit and purpose, right? We did a consulting project back in the day. They're a FTSE 100 company. And we said, well, what does it mean to be purposeful? This is a company that has, I don't know, billions, even, annual revenue. And we said, well, what is our purpose if we exist on this world? What is our reason for being? And there was a real conversation like, well, isn't our purpose to be profitable? And I know that's a cynical throwaway comment, but there is truth to that, because you can't be purposeful if you're not profitable, right? But equally, if your only purpose is to make profit, you will never actually succeed. So there's a balance in between the two of them to say, hopefully the outcome of being purposeful is profit, but at the same time, you have to have a commercial viability. So there's always that balance, I think, to strike. And it's not a very clear one, right? In terms of how you want to be big enough so that you can reach people to have the impact you want. And you can't do that by giving everything for free at a small scale. So it's understanding those competing, sometimes not competing, but those nuance of conversation. So there's a couple of points that I just thought was really helpful to kind of reflect on as you're talking about, your journey and what you've done to build Circe to where it is. I think it's just fantastic. So again, huge congrats to what you've achieved so far.
Thank you.
I was thinking about, the broader conversation here around community-based mental health, which Circe obviously deals with directly. What do you think has been, I guess, the evolution of community-based mental health over the past, the present, and the future? You've mentioned that we've becoming more comfortable and aware of the discussion. Where do you think we've come from, and where do you think we are today, and where do you think we're going? Hopefully, in the future. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think here postpartum mental health and the experience of early motherhood is actually probably the best example to kind of illustrate the role community has had over time in our happiness and general well-being.
Right.
I'm sure you've heard about the now infamous 80-year-long Harvard study on the biggest determinant of good health. And it turns out that it is actually social connection. And I found the most interesting part around that point as well is that you don't even need to have strong social ties. You don't have to have best friends. As long as you're not completely on your own, then already that makes such a huge difference. I saw another piece of health comms. I'm forgetting now where I read it, that apparently loneliness can be just as detrimental statistically to your health as smoking cigarettes. And
Yes.
I think when we think about postpartum healthcare, we know that traditionally in a lot of cultures, you used to have the 40-day quarantine, and your village would come and take care of you and the baby and bring you food. And I think we used to have that village. And I think for maybe a couple of hundreds of years, we forgot that that's actually how humans are meant to live.
Yes.
I think that maybe up until somewhere over the 100-ish years, we also saw an institutionalization of mental health care. The fact that we took people out of their homes and out of their communities and put them into institutions also further stigmatized mental health care and really sanitized it.
Yes.
And what we are finally seeing now is that people are saying, well, actually, this is the wrong way to think about it. We're also seeing an increased amount of therapists also coming forward and saying that actually, we can do CBT all day long, but if you have these stressors in your life and no one to rely on, then actually
Yes.
therapy isn't going to help.
Yeah.
I met someone a couple of months ago who specifically does mental health care for men in the construction industry.
Okay.
And one thing he also started to do as part of the services was to provide financial literacy services and workshops on sort of how to structure your debt, how to save for the future, also sort of like addiction and gambling workshops. And it was like these things that work together. Sorry, but just to bring it back to the motherhood experience, I think we're finally realizing that actually this hyper individualistic society that we're living in, where you can kind of pay for services, is not really working. And we are finally starting to see a shift towards community based mental health care, healthcare in general. We're seeing social prescribing more and more nowadays. We know that the NHS is also prioritizing it with their 10-year plan, the hospital to community, which is fantastic. So I think it's kind of I think the past 100 years have been very individualistic, but I think we're finally the tide is
Yeah.
finally turning again. I hope.
Yeah. I think you do a great job of painting that picture, Claudia. It's really clear and the way that you portray it, like the evolution of us as a culture, a society. There's a point here where technology was probably the instigator of being more isolated, but there can also be the solution because platforms like yours use technology to therefore connect people again. Absolutely right to call out where the NHS is going, which is great, like this idea of moving from the National Health Service to your neighborhood health service and, hospitals community. It feels right. I think inherently there's a gut feel where you're like, well, actually, institutions don't really feel like the place to heal and to be in. And whereas the idea of being surrounded by people that care for you and know you from a personal perspective, not just from a clinical perspective, feels like the right way to go. I would also, highlight that talk that you mentioned is a fantastic discussion. I think just really well laid out in terms of the 80-year study, and to look at what really matters, because inherently we all innately know this. Like you feel better when you've got people that care for you and that you've got the connections. That makes a lot of sense, right? And I think you can feel that as opposed to just in addition to the evidence, which shows you that it is the right way to go. So I'm just really pleased that, people like yourselves are going out there to create these offerings and that you're getting the traction that I think you deserve. Does the future then, is it more of this? We're seeing some initial traction. We're seeing trends going the right way. Is it more about now community-based mental health and group therapy just becoming much more mainstream? Is that where you see things going in the future?
I really, really hope so. One thing that I'm personally quite worried about is obviously everyone is talking about AI. I
Yeah.
personally think that when applied correctly and with the right safeguards within it, it can really help us solve a lot of problems, including in mental health care.
Mm,
I do, however, worry that it can also silo us. But
yes.
I think that because it's such an interesting conversation, because I think healthcare in general exists within the wider cultural and political and economic setting. I think
Mm,
whether we have healthy lives or not is not as individual of a decision as a lot of people make it out to be.
mm.
I do think that on pretty much every plane except for technology, we are moving towards accepting that and working together towards a healthier future. And I do hope we stay the course.
Yeah. And again, I think the conversation on AI will always be a topical one and everyone will have different perspectives. I believe, like you, that it can be a huge enabler to free up human time to connect more in depth. And I think all of these conversations will be nuanced. It will be neither good nor completely bad. And there's all sorts in between. And that's where I think that there is value to be taken. One of the few questions I wanted to cover off as well is, when do people come to therapy? So how do we help people that we think may need help? So the first question is, you would recommend that someone is going through a really difficult time to seek therapy. But there is also a point where is there value in coming to these conversations, even if you don't feel like, you don't have to hit that red line before you seek therapy. When do people come to you?
This is actually a really hard question to answer. I would say that it's one of those cases where if you know, you know. And I would say that if there's even a small part of you that thinks, oh, I could actually really benefit from talking to someone, I think people should definitely go out and do that
Yeah.
wherever feasible. I think when it comes to postpartum mental health, especially, we know that suicide is the leading cause of death of new mothers within a year of giving birth.
Yes.
And I think, especially with this, because there's so much ingrained sort of ideals around how you are meant to feel and act as a new mother. A lot of women, for example, told us that they're scared to go to their GP and tell them how they're actually thinking because so many of them are scared that they're going to take their baby away.
Yes.
It- so it's kind of difficult to answer the question. I think if any mom feels like they should talk to someone, definitely do it. You don't have to sort of get to a point where you just can't take it anymore. I also think that, I mean, I would take it a step out as well and say that for anyone with any sort of mental health conditions, even a therapy sessions a couple of times a year can make such a huge difference to your outlook in life.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very considered response, Claudia, you've mentioned. Again, it doesn't have to wait until you redline and have to then react to that problem, but just seeing that as, there will probably be value in every mother having this conversation, or new mother. Or, I mean, everyone in general would benefit from some form of discussion or an outlet in order to understand yourself better. So I think that's just a helpful consideration for how people present. My last question was to go towards the carers of those mothers, or the partners, or the parents, etc. Oftentimes, it will be those people that are meeting every day with the mother that realize, hey, something isn't quite right. And the mother or the person going through those issues may not realizing their downward trajectory. And I've talked about this in the past, and the difficulty sometimes of, as the carer looking in on someone, you desperately want to help, but it's very difficult to suggest, hey, I think you're not quite right. And would you be inclined to try this? And have you, in your journey, one, have you seen that yourselves? And two, is there any guidance you might provide to people caring for those mothers that may need that, and how they can help to guide them?
Actually, what we found from our own research is that most moms who end up in therapy are referred to therapy by their partners. So whatever husbands and other partners are doing at this moment in time, it seems to be working to some extent. I wouldn't know what the official guidance on this would be,
Sure.
but I think from my own personal experience with mental health and, loved ones staging very well-meaning interventions that did help me is that I think if you have a friend or a spouse or anyone in your life, a sibling who is struggling, I think finding a way in which you communicate to them about how you are perceiving it in a very compassionate and understanding way. I think that a lot of people will initially have a strong negative reaction to that, but I do think that it's essential that we do this work for the people in our lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Couldn't agree more. Claudia, this has been a really great conversation. I really appreciate everything you're doing. Have we missed anything out that you think we should touch upon before we think about how to round out and the key take homes for people listening in?
I mean, I don't think we've missed anything, but I guess the one message I would love to leave people with is that being there for each other is really one of the most important things that we can do, and it impacts every single area of our life. I think if you want others to be there for you, you also have to take that first step. And yeah, I would love to empower everyone to make a little connection, to make a few more connections as they after they've listened to this.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful sentiment. Thank you, Claudia. And to close things out, I'd love to please tell people about where to find Circe, if you're on any social channels, how they can find you, because we'll put some links in the description, but I'd love for you just to promote yourselves. And I think it's such a great service that you're providing.
Thank you. So we live on Instagram. I believe you mentioned you're going to link it below. You can also find us at hello-circe.com. If anyone wants to join our newsletter, that would make us very, very happy, because I'm much more of a written word kind of communicator than photo or video. So please join our newsletter.
Awesome. Claudia, I'm so pleased with the progress you've made with Circe. And yeah, here's to more conversation in future, or newsletters as you feel best.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Thank you.